Hello, everyone. And today I would like to discuss the most interesting topic, in my opinion. And it is very close to my heart because I personally work in the third line. I personally work in the second line. I also work in the first line. So I can talk about the differences and the difficulties that the second line is facing compared to the third line. And as a disclaimer, with this video, I don't want to depreciate one line to compare with other. This is not my intention, absolutely not, because I think we always need to acknowledge the pros and cons of every line and also the challenges that every line is facing. They are not the same, but they are fairly equal, right? So we should remember of this. And as a part two, I would like to discuss about the third line versus the second line and the first line. So today, the second line versus the third line, and I would be also referring to the first line. Because the problem, in my personal opinion, not between the second and the third line, but rather when the people are confusing the first line with the second line or second line with the first line and other way around. So let's get started, and I would welcome all your notes or comments or your suggestions or your thoughts regarding how do you see the second line if you work yourself there, or how you compare yourself with the third line, and these thoughts that you might have while you're watching this video. So we own it, we monitor it, and we report it. So I would like, in order to discuss this video, I would like to take the most, let's say, difficult and painful scenario when CFO is managing and accountable and responsible for the second line. And I must admit that here, maybe I sound very toxic. I promise do not compare and say that here is easier, there is harder. But I think the second line has got a biggest struggle compared with the third in regards of independency. At least the third line has got that clear line of independency, whereas the second line doesn't. And also another very important highlight that I want to note, that the second line does not have the standards as the third line. So in my personal and professional opinion, this might be COSO standards, but again, there is no clearly defined standards that we have to follow. So that's why there are a lot of differences in perception, differences in the treatment, and differences in the management. But all in all, in my professional opinion and to my experience, I've always seen that CFO was managing the second line. So why we draw lines at all? So a lot of people, and again, even my peers, sometimes really mixing the first line and the second line. It is very easy to distinguish from the third line, but again, there also could be some misconception. So the first line is, as here I wrote, plays the game. So in a very plain language, in order to determine who is the first line in your organization, you need to ask who does own the process. And also, it's like ownership is also a very broad explanation. What does it mean in a practice? It means that the person is accountable and person is responsible for managing the risk, for executing the task, for adhering to the standards. So they are doers. And of course, there is a business process owner. Then you might ask, okay, but the second line also owns some kind of process. They're also accountable. They're also responsible for their area of expertise, area of responsibility. That's true, but we're not talking about the accountability and responsibility on the broader term. We're talking about the business. So, all in all, if you can say and reply very clearly who owns the business process. Let's take finance. Who owns the business, who the business process owner? And the first person who would come up to your mind would be the CFO, the high-level business owner. So this person is accountable for the certain processes. This person also could be responsible. He is responsible for mitigating the certain risk, adhering to the policies and procedure, and executing the task. Yes, he does. They have a team who is responsible and also to a certain extent accountable. But all in all, as a pyramid, he is on the top. And then he is, as a business, high-level business process owner, is accountable. Can we tell the same about the second line? Whether they are accountable or owns any business process? The response should be no. Then we can clearly define if response no, then it is the purely second line. If response is yes, then the line is the first. So we have this question mark, as I'm saying, very questionable lines, let's say legal. Legal, it's kind of, yes, they do own the process, but on the other hand, they are also like coaches and referees. They are giving the expertise, they're giving support, they do the monitoring, they challenge the process, they help the first line manage the risk and watch that it does. But if you ask me from that formula perspective, whether they own the process, most probably they do. So for instance, they are managing some, I don't know, debt collection, some contingency planning. So there are like a certain business processes that are not related to only support and monitoring. It is related to very specific business process. So for instance, I used to work as an auditor in the bank, and in the bank, the lawyers, they are very hands-on. So they cannot be the second line because they are giving their expertise. They're part of the process of the loan issuance. So that's why we cannot call them purely second line. That's why they are a little bit here and there. So it's super blurred. But I want us today to be a little bit binary. From the binary, this question, yes or no, they are absolutely this first line. So what is the third line? It's a league referee. It's independent assurance. It reports to the board, reports to the audit committee. It's giving the oversight and, of course, independent assurance and the review of what was happening with the players and what was happening with the coach and referees. Whatever referees were recommending, it's purely mitigating the risk, whether it was correctly executed, whether it was mitigating all the business risk, whether the risk were articulated correctly, whether the controls were put on their place. So this is what auditors are doing. And sometimes, as I work for this boss leagues, let's say the second and the third lines, sometimes people are saying, oh, then the auditors are just repeating what already been done by the second line. Could be if there is no reliance model, but today I'm not going to touch upon on the reliance model. But if we're talking about the second line is a more closer to the business. So they're looking at the risk from the very operational layer. So they're looking into the transactions, whether the transactions are mitigated, whether all the business processes are defined. So I would give you an example. So the second line is designing the controls around the segregation of duties. So they're looking into the way it is set up in your ERP system. They're designing the controls. They're making sure that it is implemented as it is intended, and they also might test it and monitor. But because they are designers, they cannot provide the independent assurance. So that's why what auditors would do, they will go and check whether it was really mitigating the risk, whether it is connected to your financial statement assertions, for instance, whether it is clearly set up, whether you have all the control performers, all the control owners onboarded, everyone understands the system was working as intended. We have a detective, we have preventive controls. But all this dirty work have been done already by the second line. And basically, the internal audit work should not be the work that is checking the work of the second line. They rather need to understand, okay, how I need to evaluate and estimate the controls in place. And sometimes the auditors, they're also looking a little bit more broader, right? They are not only looking into the controls. The control environment is a big portion of your work, but they're also looking into the processes, which might be let's say, overlooked by the second line because they are focused on the specific transactions, on the specific pillars. So their work is a little bit like a low level, and I don't want to say that it's less important. It is very much important because it's a filter. Imagine it is like you have different layers of filter. So you have the first filter as a first line, then you have multiple layers, filters designed by the second line, which are, of course, they're not doing by themselves, but they're designing it. It is done by the first line, right? And then the layer number 3, it is the third line who needs to go through a high level understanding, okay, if the control environment is okay, we can trust this. Maybe we need to check the process end to end. Maybe we need to look into the different risk. Maybe we really challenge the risk profile. Maybe we need to challenge the risk framework, etc., etc. So the next one, it's not seniority, it is independence. Of course, as I said, the second line is the part of the management. They should be part of the management, and that creates it is a beauty and ugliness at the same time. They sit inside the management, report through it. They help design controls, monitors, answer to executive management, cannot provide independent assurance over itself. Then the third line, it's independent of management. It reports functionally to the audit committee, independent test controls and execute the controls, the audits. They are not only testing the controls, and that's, even though I've written it down, but it's also a misconception that the auditors are only testing the controls that are designed by the second line. This would be a very sad job of internal audit. Answer to the governing body and exist to assure the board and the second line operating, second and the first line operating correctly. So its assurance is periodic and independent. So can they audit their own work? Second line, no, they cannot. But as I said, they can provide the help and support to the management to execute the self-assessment. In the SOX, it's very clearly defined that you might have some of them, they should have the self-assessment where they need to assess and evaluate the internal control environment by themselves, test the design, and operating effectiveness. Of course, it will be considered as a self-assessment because the second line is the part of the management, even though they are not a business process owner and they somewhat providing some kind of challenge and let's say the oversight, but they are not fully independent. That's the point, right? And of course, third line can do this, right? They can audit not their own work. They can audit what this first and the second line doing. So the CFO trap, the pain point that I wanted to point it out. This is again coming back to a misconception of the first and the second line. Coming back to the point that we discussed earlier. So let's assume that CFO owns and the entire internal control, the second line is reporting and answering to the CFO. And CFO and the financial area is the biggest risk. And it's in practice, it's the biggest coverage area for all the controls. So imagine that CFO is the manager, he's accountable, he's a business process owner, and he is the second line, also owner somehow and manager. And then he needs to challenge his own work. Of course, it creates a huge conflict of interest. And of course, it's very much depend on the maturity of the CFO. I'm not trying to say that it by default it's wrong, but it is an ugly thing. And that's why I'm saying competences is not the problem, structure is. It very much limits the second line to do the work correctly. And that's why it creates a big pressure on the third line to validate that, because they already know that this area might be under risk because it is under CFO. It's very natural. No, it's nothing we can do with this. It's very natural thing. Yes, and the CFO is also the first line for huge stretch of risk, right? The closing, the treasury, financial reporting itself. And when the same office also monitors and reports on those processes, the chain has no independent voice. And it's not about even conflict of interest or independence. It's just the quality of the work, right? For instance, accrual is materiality miscalculated in the CFO on process. The controls function watching is also reports to the CFO. Results are presented to the audit committee by the CFO. Nobody's structurally free to say anything. So, of course, here I put the worst case scenario where there is no even third line, and it's even creating the biggest problem. So, what to do in this case? Of course, we need to keep the accountability and we need to separate the roles. First line, as usual, needs to operate the controls. They own the business process, they operate. The second line need to monitor and challenge with its own mandate. Even though they are reporting to the, let's say, the CFO, they need to have a clearly mandate given by the authority, audit committee or a board of directors to have that level of autonomy operate and having the access to the somehow not maybe to the audit committee, but somehow to the upper management if some situations occur. And of course, the third line assures the board that both are real, right? So accountability as the business owner, the CFO is a business owner, stays with the CFO. Independent challenge does not live inside the CFO office. This is very nice, right? So how to build it? 5 building blocks for a real second line. So what makes a second line real? As I already mentioned, a board-owned mandate. So we need to have the chapter approved by the audit committee or anyone, not editable by the executive. So they cannot challenge it. So it should go through the supervisory body. Owns the framework and the challenge, it never owns the business outcome. Again, if it is unavoidable that CFO needs to own the process of internal controls or risk management or something like that, there should be some layer or direction or the line, dotted line, that could allow the second line to process also, let's say, independently. They should not be independent because they should be a part of the management, but the challenge. Or the audit committee itself would be monitoring the CFO, who is also observing the second line in a different manner, that they would also feel comfort that it is bringing all the problems. It is not hiding the problems, for instance, due to the conflict of interest part. Set frameworks, support, monitor, challenge, report, not operate controls or assure the board, so the right activities only. Protected escalation, as already mentioned, direct, unfiltered access to the audit committee, build the road before you need it. Competence and standing, senior enough to not to be overruled, skilled enough that the challenge is credible. So that's very much important. And actually, this is coming from my personal experience because I had this pain point managed by the CFO. The line you must not cross. It does. Set frameworks, policies. This is the second line. Provide expertise and support. Sure. Monitors within the risk appetite. Sure. Challenge first line decisions. Sure. Aggregate and report risk report. Sure. It must not operate the control itself. No, it is the first line. Assure the board it's all fine. This is the third line of job of the third line. So what do we need to bring it from here? What are we going to say as a takeaway? Operate, monitor, assure, never in one office. It shouldn't be. So remember, operate, monitor, and assure should not stay in one office. The second line is the management or monitoring and challenge. Powerful, expert, but inside management. The third line is independent assurance that reports to the board. Build these 5 blocks that we discussed, and you have second line words on the name, and actually where you can also create the reliance model. We can also your third line believe in your also your auditors, the external auditors. And in this regard, I think we can summarize that the most important here is not who is reporting to whom. It is important to distinguish how to determine what is the second line or what's this first line. This is the step number 1. And then clearly define your mandate and ask for this and demand this, because you cannot build something sustainable in the second line if you cannot be independent. And of course, we are supporting management. We are trying to make life better. But sometimes management just challenge ourselves in the second line and we cannot do our job. And in order to do our job, that everyone would be doing our job, we need to have it. Please remember that you should not play the third line, and that's what we're going to discuss in the next episode. You shall not play the second line, but you also should keep some level of independency, or at least some level of mandate. Even not some, but you need to have a clear mandate. So I think with that, I would like you to thank you for your attention, and I would welcome all your comments and maybe some thoughts that you got while you were listening to me. And I'm looking forward to the next episode discussing the third line versus the second line and the first line. See you there.